The mountains had a way of breathing, slow, endless sighs that curled through the pines and over the white ridges like whispers of forgotten secrets. Gideon Nash had lived long enough among those sighs to think himself part of them, a shadow stitched into the snow. Yet even shadows could ache with hunger, with loneliness, with the quiet longing for a touch that might remind them they were human. His cave was a shallow wound in the cliffside, and he was the bandage clinging to its edges, cold pressing into his ribs, silence gnawing at his thoughts. He tended his fire with the tenderness of a man tending a fragile heartbeat, and every night, as sparks lifted like tiny prayers toward the dark, he wondered if anyone in the world still remembered his name. It was in that emptiness, in that aching cold, that the story began to shift, not with thunder or fate's roaring drum, but with a faint groan against the snow, so small it might have been mistaken for the mountain itself. Gideon rose, half fearful, half drawn by something older than survival, the fragile yearning to not be alone. What he saw through the white veil of storm was not a beast, nor a trick of his starving mind, but a streak of crimson staining the snow and a body lying fragile and still beside it. Black hair spread like ink on ice, a young girl carved from grace and suffering, a stranger dropped into his frozen solitude. She was a question written by destiny, and in answering it, Gideon would tear open the silence that had swallowed him for years. He felt the tremor of choice run through him, a trembling that wasn't from the cold. He could have turned back, could have closed his ears to her weak breath, and let the storm finish what the world had begun. But the memory of his father's voice echoed through his bones. "You ain't an animal, Gideon. You're a man, and men did not abandon lives to the snow." With hands stiff from frost, but guided by something deeper, he lifted her, her body as light as a bird's, but heavy with the weight of his own fate. Each step toward the cave was agony, each breath a battle against the storm, and yet he carried her as though carrying his own salvation. For the first time in years, there was warmth against his shoulder, fragile as it was. Inside the cave, firelight flickered over two faces where once there had only been one. He worked with clumsy devotion, his last strips of cloth, his last scraps of strength, all poured into tending the wound that threatened her life. Her eyes fluttered open for moments, and in those moments Gideon felt the cavern shift. It was no longer an empty tomb, but a place of breath, of fragile hope, of two lives stitched together by chance. Her name was Ayana, spoken like a song on lips cracked by pain, and when she pressed a carved stone into his palm before sliding back into unconsciousness, it felt like she had placed her very soul in his keeping. He sat in the quiet after, listening not to silence any more, but to the faint rhythm of another's life mingling with his own. The days that followed were a blur of fevered care, of watching firelight dance across her features, of learning the language of her breathing, the way he once learned the tracks of deer in snow. Each sound from her lips, even delirious, was a healing balm on his solitude. He smiled without knowing he still could. And when the storm broke at last, sunlight spilling into the cave, it illuminated not just the mountains cloaked in white, but the boy within them who was no longer entirely alone. In stories such as these, there is always more waiting just beyond the horizon, more trials, more tenderness, more proof that love finds its way even in the coldest wilderness. And as Gideon stepped out into the blinding light, his heart beating with a rhythm he thought he had lost, the journey of two souls drawn together by fate and by fire truly began. If these words bring warmth to your spirit, if you feel the healing breath of this tale stirring gently inside your heart, let that feeling flow. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe so that this story may continue weaving its quiet magic around you. Because in listening, in belonging, we are never truly alone. Snow fell in slow, endless veils outside the cave, a curtain between Gideon and the world he had long forgotten. Inside, the fire threw gentle circles of light across the stone, and in that flicker, two lives began to share the same fragile rhythm. Ayana's breath was shallow at first, fragile threads of air that seemed ready to snap, but Gideon listened to each one as if his own survival depended on it. He had known hunger, known silence, known the ache of cold pressed so deep into his bones that it threatened to turn him into stone. But he had never known the strange tenderness that grew in him as he pressed a damp cloth to her brow, as he held a spoon of thin broth to her lips, as he kept the fire alive not just for himself, but for another. Every motion was care, every heartbeat a prayer that she might live, and in that prayer there was healing for the hollow places inside him. Ayana stirred in her fever, whispers tumbling from her lips in a language Gideon did not understand. He leaned closer, drawn by the music in her voice. Her words were fragments of rivers, of sun, of a father's love. And though he could not translate them, he felt them as if they were woven into his own skin. Her dreams spilled into the silence like rivers breaking through ice, and he let them flow through him, softening the hard edges that loneliness had carved. He discovered the miracle of listening not to the mountain or the wind, but to a single life pulsing weakly beside him. Even when her voice faded back into silence, the echo lingered, a soft reminder that he was no longer alone. The days blurred into one another, each one marked by small victories, her fever breaking in the night, color returning to her cheeks, the faint curve of a smile when she opened her eyes to find him there. He had grown used to surviving on the edge of nothing, measuring existence in handfuls of wood and scraps of food. But now he found himself counting in breaths, in glances, in the way her gaze softened when it found him. There was something unspoken in those eyes, a recognition that went beyond words, as though she knew he had carried not only her body through the storm, but also her hope. When the sun finally rose after the long storm, its light spilled into the cave like a blessing, pale and golden. Gideon stepped outside to the stillness of a world remade, snow sparkling like glass beneath the sky. Yet the peace of the mountains carried a new weight, for he knew the world beyond the cave would not remain quiet. Hunger pressed at his belly, emptiness tightened around him, and he would need to leave her side to find food. Before he went, he looked back, and Ayana's eyes met his, clearer now, no longer clouded by fever. She gave him a faint smile, one that seemed to hold the strength of survival itself, and though she said nothing, he felt her trust settling over him like a mantle he could not shrug off. He descended into the valley, each step heavy with the knowledge that for the first time in years someone waited for his return. The snow was deep, the wind sharp, but he hunted with a fire inside him that no storm could quench. At last, his snares yielded a rabbit, small but precious, a gift from the mountain itself. He returned with that fragile prize, his heart lightened not by the meat, but by the thought of sharing it. Yet when he climbed the last rise and saw tracks in the snow, hoof prints too deep and too many to belong to strays, his chest tightened with dread. The world had shifted again. This girl, this sudden miracle in his cave, was not only a gift but a burden tied to something larger than his own quiet exile. The symbol carved on the stone she had given him appeared once more, etched into the bark of a tree. It was no longer just her mark. It was a summons, a claim, a sign that others were searching. Gideon knew then that his silence, once impenetrable, was already unraveling. He had saved her, but in saving her he had opened his door to a tide far stronger than he could hold back. And yet, as he stood at the mouth of the cave, clutching the meagre rabbit in his hand, his eyes found Ayana where she lay by the fire, her head lifted now, her spirit unbroken. In her presence, the fear softened, if only for a heartbeat. He did not yet know who would come, nor what storm they would bring with them, but he knew this: he would not let her face it alone. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of approaching footsteps, of voices he had not heard in years. The silence of his life had ended, and with it began the story of trust tested by fire, of belonging forged in danger. The cave that had been his grave was now the threshold of something larger, something unknown, and in its glow the fragile bond between boy and girl deepened into a promise that neither of them could yet name. The cave had once been only stone and shadow, a place of exile and hunger, but with Ayana there it softened into something else, something almost sacred. Gideon discovered in her presence that silence could be shared, and in sharing it, silence lost its sharp edges. Each day he rose with purpose, tending to her fire, preparing what little food he could gather, watching over her as though the fragile thread of her life was now braided into his own. She lay wrapped in furs, her face pale but no longer ghostly, and in the curve of her lips as she slept, Gideon felt a strange peace begin to heal the hollows of his heart. When Ayana opened her eyes, dark and luminous as river stones, Gideon felt the world shift around him. She would study him quietly, her gaze tracing the lines of weariness on his young face, the calluses on his hands, the raw determination that had carried her through the storm. In those moments, words were not needed. He offered her broth, crude and thin, yet she accepted it with a gratitude that humbled him. Every time her fingers brushed his, light as a feather, Gideon felt warmth bloom inside him like embers catching on dry wood. The girl who had entered his cave half dead was becoming something more than a guest, more than a burden. She was a presence, a mirror, a balm against the loneliness that had carved him hollow. Her voice returned in fragments. At first she spoke in her own tongue, the syllables flowing like water, melodic and soft. Though Gideon did not understand, he listened with reverence, as though her words themselves were healing. She spoke of her people, of the wide rivers and forests of her homeland, of laughter and family, of a world Gideon had long believed lost to him. He answered with gestures, with simple English words she began to repeat. Slowly, painfully, they built a language of their own, a mixture of smiles, glances, touches, and fragments of speech. It was clumsy, but it was theirs, and in that shared effort grew something tender, something neither of them had planned for. At night, when the storm outside finally gave way to skies bright with stars, Ayana would lie close to the fire while Gideon carved small shapes from scraps of wood. He gave her a tiny bird one evening, rough and unpolished, but her fingers curled around it with such gentle affection that he felt his chest tighten. She placed it near the stone she had pressed into his hand the night he saved her, the carved hawk gleaming in the firelight like a promise. He began to understand that it was not only a gift, but a symbol of who she was and the people who would come looking for her. Fear pressed at him, yet it was softened by the knowledge that whatever storm awaited, he would face it differently now, not as an orphan surviving by instinct, but as a boy who had found someone worth protecting. Their days unfolded like fragile threads, weaving a tapestry. Gideon showed her how he set his snares, how he traced animal tracks in the snow, how he listened for the shift of wind that warned of danger. Ayana, in turn, whispered names for things he had never known. The bird that cried at dawn, the herb that soothed pain, the word for fire spoken like a song. She laughed once, a soft, unsteady sound, when he mispronounced her language, and that laugh lit the cave brighter than any flame. Gideon found himself smiling too, a smile that no longer felt foreign, but alive, warm, and real. The bond between them deepened not with declarations, but with the small, steady rhythm of survival shared. When Gideon's rough hands brushed her hair back from her brow, when she reached to steady him as he stumbled from exhaustion, when their eyes lingered too long on each other's faces, each moment stitched them closer together. He had once thought himself carved from cold and silence, but with Ayana he discovered he was still flesh, still capable of feeling the tender ache of belonging. And yet, beneath that warmth lay the shadow of uncertainty. The carved hawk, the marks in the snow, the knowledge that she was not simply a girl lost in the storm, but someone's daughter, someone's kin, tethered to a world larger and more dangerous than the two of them together. Gideon felt the weight of it pressing closer with each passing day. But whenever doubt rose in him, Ayana's hand would brush against his, her gaze steady and full of quiet trust. It was enough to silence the fear for a while, enough to remind him that some choices in life were not about survival, but about holding on to the fragile, healing miracle of connection. The mountains outside glistened with dangerous beauty, and unseen eyes already searched for her. But within the cave, by the light of the fire, a boy who had been broken by solitude and a girl who had been wounded by violence were binding themselves into something neither storm nor shadow could easily break. The healing had begun, and with it, the quiet seed of love. The world beyond the cave changed its breath before Gideon heard a single footstep. The air grew taut, like a bowstring drawn back, and the quiet that had cradled them shifted into a waiting silence. He was kneeling at the fire, coaxing a small pot to simmer, when Ayana's gaze lifted past him to the mouth of the cave. Her eyes, so often soft, so often filled with the gentleness that had begun to heal him, went still and bright. The carved stone beside her glinted, and Gideon felt the truth ripple through him. Whoever had left those marks below had arrived. He stood slowly. The snowlight pooled at the cave's threshold, and out of it stepped a figure draped in a buffalo robe, tall as a tree and heavy with a presence that made the very air step back. His hair was braided with fur, his face carved by weather and battle and love deeper than words. Behind him, two warriors took their places like shadows laid carefully by fate, bows quiet in their hands, resolve anchored in their stances. The man's eyes found Gideon first. They were dark, fathomless, and assessing, a hawk's gaze that measured distances and truths at the same time. Gideon's hand, without thinking, tightened around the hatchet he had used to carve wood and split kindling, not to harm. Yet, in that instant, it felt like a confession. He loosened his grip and let the handle settle against the stone. The man stepped farther into the firelight, and Gideon saw the smallest change in him, a breath of softness when his eyes lifted toward Ayana. That breath was a father's breath. Relief, terror, gratitude, rage at what had hurt his child, all braided together. Words came, low and rough, in Ayana's language. Gideon could not catch them, but he heard the shape of their meaning. The leader's tone was accusation first, then command. He gestured at the stitched wound, at the humble nest of furs, at the boy who had no business holding his daughter's life between his shaking hands. Ayana tried to rise. Gideon reached to steady her, then pulled back, unsure whether touching her would worsen what already looked unforgivable. She lifted her chin and spoke, soft, breathless, but unbroken. Each syllable was a thread thrown across the distance between her and the towering man. He answered sharply, and she answered once more, pointing to the pot of melted snow, to the clean cloths torn from Gideon's shirt, to the crude needle and sinew, to the last strip of meat saved for her. The warrior's gaze landed on each thing in turn, as though weighing stones in the palm of his hand. The two sentries at the cave mouth shifted, narrowing the space with their bodies. Gideon felt his heart beating hard enough to bruise his ribs, but he kept his hands visible, his posture low, the way you'd stand before a wild creature and promise you meant no harm. He didn't look away from the father. Respect, his pa had taught him, was a language older than speech. A single word left Ayana's lips, his name. The way she said it steadied him. Gideon Nash. The sound of it, his name spoken like a promise rather than a memory, moved through the cave like a warm current. The leader's attention returned to Gideon. He pointed at his own chest, said a name that thudded with authority. Gideon heard Takakota in it. He nodded, feeling something solemn pass between them, a recognition hammered at the anvil of necessity. Takakota crouched at Ayana's side. His enormous hand, scarred, sure, hovered above the stitched wound, not touching until his own breath calmed enough to offer comfort instead of fear. He examined the seam Gideon had sewn. The young boy feared the judgment that would come, mockery for coarse work, anger for daring. But when Takakota lifted his gaze, there was neither. In place of scorn was a single, tight nod. It was not praise. It was something truer. Acknowledgement. You have done what needed doing. That nod moved through Gideon like fire through winter kindling. He felt himself anchored. The warriors relaxed a fraction. The cave breathed again. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say he hadn't taken Ayana. He had taken responsibility. But words felt blunt and too small. So he did what his life had taught him. He offered action. He reached for the pot and ladled a small sip of broth into the wooden spoon, then knelt and passed it to Ayana. She accepted, sipped, and closed her eyes in relief. He set the spoon down and withdrew, palms open. The gesture was a bridge, quiet, careful, healing. Takakota watched, and this time the shift in his expression was unmistakable. The hard line eased. He spoke briefly to his men. One disappeared into the glittering noon. The other took his watch at the threshold, his stance no longer a blade but a shield. The father turned back to Gideon and touched his own chest once more, then tapped the hawk carved into the stone at Ayana's side. He made a sweeping motion toward the mountains, a sign of the clan stretching beyond the horizon, of the web of blood and promise that would always pull her home. His eyes asked the question without raising his voice. How did she come to be here, in your care? Gideon looked down, sought the words, and found one that mattered most. He placed his palm lightly over his heart and said, "Cold." He mimed the storm with both hands. Then he pressed his fingers to the stitched seam at her side, let his gaze lift with a reverence that needed no translation. "Help." He spread his hands wide toward the gathered things of care, cloth, broth, the meager firewood pile spent almost to nothing. Then he pointed to himself and shook his head, a small truth laid bare. He had little. Then to Ayana, a soft, humbled, everything. Silence took the room, but it was not the cutting silence that had haunted Gideon for years. This was the quiet that follows a truth landing in the heart. Ayana's fingers found the small wooden bird he had carved for her. She held it up like a lantern, then set it beside the hawkstone so that the two tokens touched. She spoke to her father, a handful of tender syllables, and though Gideon could not grasp their meaning, he felt the warmth of them seeping through the stone floor and into his bones. Takakota answered in a voice that had thunder in it, and mercy too. He lifted the hawkstone, weighed it in his palm, then pressed it gently back into Gideon's hand. For one beat, Gideon thought he was being tasked, burdened with a symbol too heavy for a boy. But the chief's gaze said something else. "You have carried her through the storm. You can carry this small piece of us for another day." Food appeared as if the mountain had willed it, a bundle of dried meat and cakes, a water skin heavy with promise. A warrior returned with the offerings, set them down without ceremony. Gideon's body flared with hunger so sharp it pinched tears to his eyes. But he waited for Takakota's gesture before he took a piece. When permission came, a simple open hand, he ate slowly. The sharing was more than kindness. It was treaty. The fire gave its soft applause, and the cave's low ceiling gathered their breaths and braided them together. The hours lengthened. Outside, the white world stretched unbroken, but within, something knit. Takakota examined the stitches again, this time with a healer's attention rather than a father's fear. He traced the seam with a fingertip, then looked at Gideon and made with his hand the slow, exact motions of sewing, cleaning, closing, tying. He spoke a few English words that had clearly travelled hard roads to reach him. Good, care, strong. Gideon lowered his eyes, warmth unfurling in his chest like a green shoot through snow. When the scout arrived, he arrived like winter itself, soundless, certain. He spoke to Takakota in a tight murmur. The chief's jaw set. A star of tarnished metal changed hands, a badge with a history written in dust and blood. Gideon understood nothing, and then, all at once, too much. The men who had harmed Ayana were not merely thieves, they were tinder in a dry forest, and the storm that might follow would spare no one. He watched the chief's eyes turn toward the mouth of the cave, toward the valley where echoes wander miles. The warrior made 3 with his fingers. 3 of them. And then the mountain's breath shifted again, closer, harsher. Gunfire far below puckered the air and then snapped it back. Fate drawing nearer. Takakota turned to Gideon and drew 2 paths in the air. One westward, flight. One toward the mouth of the cave, fire. Gideon felt the old animal in him stir, the one that knew how to disappear, how to become fog on the slope. But Ayana's gaze found him, and what lived in it was not a plea to be saved alone. It was a recognition of the kind of saving that binds 2 lives to something larger. Healing is not only salve and water and quiet. Healing is standing, healing is staying. He nodded once. The decision settled in him like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool, unmoved by surface wind. Takakota watched that nod and answered with the solemn economy of a leader who does not waste courage. He placed a bow in Gideon's hands, the string tuned to a music older than iron. Gideon tested the draw, the weight honest and unadorned. His hands, used to carving, to mending, to lifting another person through snow, understood the bow's language, but they trembled at the word it might ask him to speak. Ayana shifted, propping herself up with a breath that was more grit than strength. She caught Gideon's wrist, her touch a steadying circle. "Light," she whispered in English, the syllables soft and careful. "You are light." It was a blessing slipped into him like warmth, a small fire set in his chest where no wind could reach. Below, voices thrashed against the valley walls. A curse shattered and froze. The hunters were driving the guilty toward the cave's narrow threshold, where justice might spill too easily into vengeance, where one death carried by the wrong arrow might be enough to ignite a prairie no snow could smother. Gideon edged to the side of the entrance, the bow held low, his body a shield in the place where stone funneled fate. He thought of his pa's hands, big and patient, mending a torn saddlebag with thread straight and true. He thought of Ayana's laugh when he stumbled over the name of fire in her language. He thought of Takakota's nod, spar, flint, spark, and of the shared food settling warm in a stomach that had forgotten kindness. He thought of how the cave had changed from a grave of silence to a cradle of breath. He thought, above all, of the fragile embroidery of peace that had begun to stitch them together, loop by loop, through storms and fear. The first outlaw broke into view, eyes blown wide, breath tearing out of him. Another came on his heels, mean and whip-thin. A third, a boy scarcely older than Gideon, stumbled with the hopelessness of someone who has already seen his own ending. Their boots scraped the stone. The world telescoped down to a ledge, a doorway, a firelight flicker that spoke of shelter. And between that flicker and their desperate hearts stood a thin, hungry boy with a bow he did not want to use, and a girl's father who could end 3 lives with a single throw. Gideon inhaled, slow and steady. A quiet gathered in him, a healing quiet that was not emptiness but resolve. When he stepped out where the snow burned white and unforgiving, he did so not to brandish a weapon, but to place himself in the only spot where mercy could be seen. He set the bow down, as deliberate as sunrise, and lowered himself to sit, cross-legged, on the narrow path. Behind him, he felt Takakota's disbelief crackle like kindling, and beyond that disbelief, respect waiting to be born. The outlaws halted, confusion breaking the script that panic had written in their muscles. Gideon lifted the hawkstone, its wings catching the thin sun. He spoke, his voice clear enough to carry, soft enough to soothe the wildness in the air. He told them what the mountains already knew, that there was no way through except through a story that did not end in blood. He offered them a choice with the steadiness of someone who has nothing to bargain with but his own life, and the unwavering hope that it is enough. Behind him, the father's shadow shifted. Ayana's breath fluttered and steadied, fluttered and steadied. In front of him, 3 lives trembled on the edge of a cliff. Between them flowed the possibility that grace, so slender, so stubborn, could hold. The mountains drew in a breath with everyone else. The next step would decide if winter devoured spring or yielded to it. And in the hush where decision gathers its strength, Gideon's small fire, lit by care, fed by courage, sheltered by love, burned on, warm enough to be seen, warm enough to lead the way into what waited beyond. The air thinned to a thread, drawn tight between the 3 men on the path, and the quiet strength gathered behind Gideon's back. He could feel Takakota's stillness like a mountain at his shoulder. He could feel Ayana's breath catch and settle, a soft tide within the cave. Snow glittered where the sun found it, and where it did not, shadows pooled. A chessboard of light and dark, upon which a single wrong move could tip them all into ruin. Gideon rested the hawkstone in his palm, as if it were a pulse he could steady with his own heartbeat. "Enough running," he said, not loud, not pleading. A statement set down like a lantern on a winter road. The bearded man, Jed, the kind whose rage made an edge of everything, lifted his rifle half an inch, eyes flicking to the cave, to the boy, to the ledges where danger might crouch. The lean one's mouth pinched with calculation, while the youngest, Billy, had already gone pale as the snow underfoot. Fear had made them hard. Fear could make them softer too, if you knew where to press. "They're behind you," Gideon continued, nodding to the valley. "They won't miss twice." "You killed what you shouldn't have. There's no path that doesn't end here, unless you lay your guns down and let breath keep doing what breath was made to do." He cut a glance to the hawkstone, then lifted it so the small wings flashed. "She lives," he added, and the words carried more than news. They carried a boundary drawn without barbs. "And if she lives, there can be another ending." Jed laughed once, a boulder rolling, blunt and dangerous. "You think a rock in your hand makes you a judge?" He shifted the rifle like a man shifting a lie in his mouth. "We go through you, boy, or we don't go at all." "It isn't me you're going through," Gideon said, and there was no bravado in it, only a quiet naming of the world as it was. "It's a father. It's a people. It's the law you broke and the ones you woke." He let his gaze settle on Billy. "It's yourself." The lean man's eyes cut toward the valley. The sound that lived there, far, faint, approaching, was not wind. It was rhythm, metallic and certain, hooves, a bugle's thin silver thread pulled through the cold. The cavalry would soon crest the slope. The choice was no longer theatrical, it had a clock. Billy saw it first. His pistol wobbled and then lowered, shaken by the tremor in his hand. "Jed," he whispered, voice breaking on a boy's terror. "Listen, I can't." He swallowed and glanced at Gideon, as though in the boy's steady calm there were permission to be the child he still was. "I don't want to die on a rock." Something old and bitter twisted Jed's mouth. "Then kneel," he spat. "Kneel and whimper. We ain't crawling." Gideon felt the moment tilt, a dish of water about to spill. He rose from the snow as gently as a man lifting a sleeping child and stepped closer, unarmed, the way you step toward a spooked horse. "Set it down," he told the lean man, not with authority, but with the kind of faith that invites a better self out of hiding. "Set it down and let the day go on breathing." The lean man hesitated, jaw working. Then, like a muscle unclenching, he let the pistol fall. Snow hushed its landing. Billy followed, as if the ground had called his name. Jed's eyes flared with a heat that wanted company in its burning. He lunged, rage turning his rifle into a cudgel. Time narrowed to the wooden arc cutting toward Gideon's temple, and then broke with a clean sound like ice cracking. A dark-feathered tomahawk wrote the last of Jed's fury into his chest. His face registered surprise, the terrible human truth that even anger must eventually meet an end. He stumbled, then folded, as quiet as the snow that received him. Gideon did not move for a breath. He felt the wind go through him, shock, sorrow, relief in a single gust. And then he turned his head. Takakota stood at the cave's lip, arms still extended from the throw, eyes unreadable and steady. The chief's gaze met Gideon's not with triumph, but with an understanding that took all the sharpness out of the moment. Mercy had been offered, boundary broken, consequence kept. There are lines a father cannot allow to be crossed. The two surviving men fell to their knees without instruction. Gideon stepped forward and, careful as a man soothing a wound, took their guns and set them aside. He could feel Ayana's eyes on him like warmth. He could feel the tribe, invisible in the rocks and trees, exhale as if a single lung had been holding back winter's breath. For a heartbeat, the mountains stilled, the way the world stills when a fever breaks. The bugle's call rose, growing from thread to rope. Hooves chopped the slope below, and with them came a danger of a different kind. Order and misreading, uniforms and the stories they prefer. Gideon's mind sparked with the shape of what the soldiers would see. A dead white man with a tribal weapon in his chest, two captives, a shadow of warriors pulling back into snow. He saw the match and the powder keg. Without waiting to be told, he moved. "Tie them," he said to no one and to everyone. And Takakota answered, the command running through his people like a hand running down a taut rope. Leather thongs bit into the criminal's wrists. The tomahawk lifted from the dead man's chest with a wet sound that made Gideon's stomach pitch. Takakota caught his eye, reached for Gideon's knife, and in swift, efficient movements altered the picture the soldiers would find, removing the telltale fletching, pressing arrow shafts into wounds, slicing Gideon's forearm just enough to redden the snow beneath him. Pain stung like clean fire. Gideon welcomed it. Sometimes a small cut keeps a larger one from being made. "Tell," Takakota said, his English sparse but exact, his hand sketching meanings in the air. "You fought, we came, we saved." Gideon nodded. The truth would not change, the telling would. Story was another kind of weapon, another kind of healing. Used gently, it could close a wound before it split to bone. The first rider crested the rise, blue coat snapped by wind, horse steaming in the cold. Captain Morrison's gaze took everything in with a soldier's economy. He saw the bound men, the dead one, the scrawny boy with blood down his sleeve, standing between a cave and two lives that might yet be spared further breaking. "Report," he said, voice even. "They came for my shelter," Gideon replied, letting a tremor he didn't have to fake run through his words. "3 of them. I fought. They fell apart." He glanced at the corpse, at the arrow wounds that were not what they seemed. "The tribe came at the end, helped drive them off. Took no blood." He breathed out slow, then added the thread that would lead the soldiers away from the camp and away from war. "They'd already gone north when your bugle sounded." Morrison's eyes, keen as a knife, flicked to the tracks. The way snow can hold a history if you know how to read. He lingered a beat too long on the wounds, on the angle of the body, on Gideon's face. Then, with the kind of pragmatism that keeps peace by knowing where not to look, he nodded. "We'll take the living ones," he said. "Find out what they did to Marshal Keene, and why." He paused, gaze softening by a degree. "You did well." The men were hauled to their feet, stumbling, snow sucking at their boots. Billy met Gideon's eyes for a brief, flickering moment, something like gratitude crossing his face before a soldier turned him by the shoulder. The lean man kept his jaw tight and looked away, choosing hardness over whatever the day had offered him. Morrison gathered his troop, set the column in motion. When he turned back, he found Gideon's refusal already formed. "Come to the settlement," the captain offered, not unkindly. "There's food, a doctor." "This is my home," Gideon answered. There was no boyish bravado in it, only the quiet of a life finally speaking its name. Morrison held his gaze, measuring the edges of that statement, then tipped a brief, respectful nod and rode out, the troop's noise fading into the white. Silence returned the way spring returns, first as a question, then as a presence. The rocks, the ledge, the cave took off their armor. Takakota stepped from the shadows, no longer a storm, but a man. His warriors emerged like trees reappearing when fog lifts. Ayana's hand was at Gideon's arm, gentle as a balm. Her eyes held the sheen of tears that come not from fear, but from the release that follows it. She touched the slice on his forearm, then placed her palm over his heart, as if checking the fire there. "Strong," she murmured, the word careful, cherished. He felt it soak into him like warmth. Takakota stood before the boy and set a heavy hand on his shoulder. He did not say thank you. The mountain had seen what needed saying. Instead, he looked down the trail the soldiers had taken and up toward the folds of wilderness that kept his people hidden when the world was not safe for them. The choice that Gideon had made, mercy over muscle, presence over flight, had cut a path between two dangers. The chief's nod was the signing of a treaty older than paper. They dismantled what little of the cave still felt like a trap and gathered what could be carried. Evening came on quiet feet, laying purple over the snow. They walked, letting the mountain guide them to a valley cradled from the wind, where fires already smoked and children's voices stitched the dusk with a mending sound. Gideon stepped into that hidden bowl as a man steps into warm water after winter, hesitant at first, then with a surrender that feels like being returned. Inside Takakota's lodge, the air tasted of cedar and smoke and stewing meat. A woman with hands wise from years cleaned Gideon's arm and bound it with a strip of soft cloth. Her touch was mother-gentle, a kind of healing he had not dared remember. Ayana rested near the fire, her posture easier, color returning to her lips like dawn to a high ridge. Gideon sat beside her, and without announcement placed the hawk stone between them. Its carved wings caught the light of that new hearth and gleamed as if they, too, were breathing easier now. The camp murmured beyond the hide walls, men's voices low, a child's laughter, quick and bright, the sound weather makes when it releases its grip. Gideon felt the shape of his life rearrange, hunger loosening, solitude lifting, purpose laying a hand across his shoulders with a weight that felt like belonging. He did not know what the next dawn would ask of him. He only knew that when it came, he would meet it with more than his own thin fire. He would meet it with a circle of breath joined to his, with a father's steady gaze to lean on, with a girl whose quiet courage had knotted itself to his own. He drew a slow breath and let it out, long and even. Healing moved through the lodge not as a dramatic flourish, but as a constant, like a hearth that does not go out. Ayana glanced at him, the corner of her mouth tilting upward. He answered with a small, unguarded smile that reached all the way to the boy he had been before the cold tried to claim him. Outside, the night settled, and with it a promise. The worst of this storm had passed, and what lay ahead, though not simple, though not free from shadow, would be walked together. The day had not ended in blood for blood. It had ended in breath for breath. And from breath a life can be built. From breath a love can learn its name. Snow softened the ribs of the valley until the camp seemed to rest inside a great, quiet breath. Nights folded themselves around the lodges like warm hands. Days opened with smoke curling upward in thin blue ribbons that stitched the sky to the earth. Gideon woke to the sound of women grinding corn, to children's laughter skipping over frost, to the steady, patient rhythm of a people whose lives were woven from work and tenderness. His old life had been a ledger of scarcity, wood, jerky, minutes before dusk. Here, time unfurled differently. Here, every act of care was a measure of wealth. He learned the camp the way he had once learned the mountain, by listening. He listened to the sing-song of greetings as dawn walked through the village, to the soft scold of a grandmother sweeping snow away from a threshold, to the sharp joy of a boy's first arrow finding the center of a straw target. He listened to the stories spoken around the fire, to the silences between them that were never empty now, but full of assent, of memory, of love. And in the thick, comforting smoke of Takakota's lodge, he listened most closely to his own breath, amazed to find it no longer catching on loneliness. Healing worked quietly, like sap rising under bark while everything still looked winter cold. Ayana's recovery gathered itself like a dawn that takes its time. She moved slowly at first, careful of the seam at her side, letting the day cradle her in gentle steps. When she walked, Gideon walked with her, never ahead, never behind, but beside, matching his rhythm to hers. They learned the edges of her strength the way you learn a friend's laugh, by meeting it again and again until it feels like a part of you. When she tired, they sat on a sun-warmed rock above the creek, watching ice loosen its silver hold on water. The creek spoke in bright syllables around the stones. It sounded to Gideon like a language his life had been trying to teach him, movement without hurry, persistence without force. In those first weeks, words still came to them like skittish birds. They made a practice of patience. Ayana taught him names, of herbs that soothed and soothed again, of constellations that held stories like bowls, of the small brown bird whose call meant weather would turn. He taught her the shapes of English that he knew, the rough little tools of his tongue. Sometimes they spoke only with hands, a palm circling slowly over the heart to say soft, fingertips pressed together and lifted to say thank you, a hand over the fire to say stay. And sometimes they let silence do the talking, trusting the warmth that settled between them to say what words could not carry without spilling. Gideon's body, thinned by years of scarcity, remembered strength as a friend who had only gone travelling. He hauled wood with the men, not to prove anything, but because the work itself felt good. The sure heft of a log, the honest ache in the shoulders, the sight of a well-stacked pile that promised flame long after sunset. A boy named Red Willow, wiry as a bow, took to teasing Gideon as if he had been born to it. "Not so skinny now," Red Willow would say, poking Gideon's ribs with a grin. "Soon you will be too heavy for a pony." Gideon laughed and felt the laughter ring clean, like a bell finding itself. Takakota watched all this with the quiet attentiveness of a man counting not the days, but the roots of a tree. At night, when the lodge settled into the low murmur of sleep, he would call Gideon to sit with him. They spoke little, and yet everything moved between them. The chief's hands, weathered and sure, showed Gideon how to straighten a bent arrow shaft over steam, how to lay sinew just so along the spine, how to read a bowstring's song for signs of wear. Gideon's hands, made clumsy by hunger, made careful by love, found the work like a map. Once, when the moon walked a thin path and the cold bit clean, Takakota led Gideon to the edge of camp and pointed at a pale scatter of stars. He named them in his language, then gestured toward the dark shoulder of the mountain, naming that too, then pressed his palm to Gideon's chest and named something there. The word he used was not one Gideon knew, but he knew its meaning by the way it warmed him. Place, belonging, you are seen. Women folded Gideon into the small rituals of the hearth without fuss. Aunties who were not his aunties showed him how to twist bread into little moons and set them along the fire's edge, how to stir a pot with patience so flavors settled into one another instead of jostling apart. A little girl with a missing front tooth, Elm, who liked to braid anything that would hold still, including Gideon's sleeve fringe, decided he needed a bracelet. She wrapped his wrist with thin rawhide and small blue beads and pronounced him better. When she ran off, her laughter like a bird startled into flight, Gideon looked at the bracelet and felt a weight lift he hadn't known he was carrying, the weight of being no one's anything. Ayana saw it too, the way the camp made room for him without ceremony. She watched him carry water, watched him crouch to show Elm how to carve a thicker-legged pony so it would stand, watched him fumble and then master the loop and tuck of a proper knot. Her smile for him held pride and a new lightness, as if she had finally set down a stone that had been in her pocket since the day the snow turned red. Sometimes, when evening was soft and everyone had eaten, Ayana told a piece of her story, how the three men had come with winter in their faces and greed in their eyes, how they had taken and taken until they found nothing left to justify what they had already decided to do. How a boy with hunger carved into him like scripture had decided to carry her anyway, even when all his learning said to lay her down. She spoke of fear without letting it own the room. She spoke of gratitude without asking for forgiveness on behalf of those who did not deserve it. Gideon listened and felt something in him widen, a field receiving rain it did not know how badly it needed. Days made their slow pilgrimage toward spring, sun stayed longer, as if it too had found the camp a place worth lingering. Snow retreated in scallops, revealing the earth with the shy boldness of a girl pulling aside a curtain. Children tested the creek with their toes and shrieked. Dogs learned the new smells of thaw, smoke thinned until it was less necessity and more invitation. On a morning so clear it made the lungs ache, Takakota led Gideon and 3 young hunters into the high timber. The forest there held a hush that felt older than speech. They tracked sign through softening drifts, delicate as a stitch, clear as a signature, learning patience from the shadows. Gideon's bow lay along his forearm, like a promise he would only keep if he had to. Red Willow ranged ahead, coming back with notes he read off the ground. Elk hair on a low branch, a scrape where antler had scolded bark, the faint, sweet musk of an animal's passing. The hunt was not fevered, but respectful. In his solitude, Gideon had hunted as a means to an end. Here he learned hunting as conversation. When the elk bull finally stood before them, haloed by light that buckled between trees, Takakota's hand rose without a sound. The forest seemed to draw nearer, listening. Gideon felt his own pulse knock at his wrist, then level out. Red Willow loosed his arrow. It found the place it needed to find. The bull staggered and sank, and silence returned the way mercy returns when grief has been honored. The men knelt and spoke thanks in a voice that belonged to all of them. Gideon did not know the words, but he knew how to place his palm against the earth and mean it. He did. They brought the meat home the way a community brings anything precious. Many hands, many steps, no one straining past what another can carry. The women met them with blankets and laughter and the deep satisfaction of a plan fulfilled. This much to be dried, this much to be stewed, this marrow for the children, these bones for tools, for flutes, for the thin music that rides night air. Gideon stood in the center of it, and something in him clicked into place. Once he had lived like a nail hammered into cold stone. Now he felt woven. That evening turned itself toward celebration without needing to be told. Songs lifted, some with hands on drum, some with feet on earth, some with voices alone. Firelight climbed up faces and braided itself into hair. Ayana sat by the door of the lodge, her wound forgotten for a little while, color rising in her like sunrise. Gideon brought her the choicest cuts that were offered to him, a small gesture made large by the way he held it, by the way she took it, eyes not leaving his. They ate and laughed and listened. They did not touch, not because they did not wish to, but because the space between them had its own sweet breath that neither of them wanted to startle. Later, when the singing softened into talk and talk softened into thought, Takakota stood with the elders in the lodge's center. He spoke of the winter that had asked too much and the hearts that had given more. He held up the hawkstone, its carved wings drinking firelight. He spoke of Gideon, not as a boy from nowhere, not as a debt incurred, but as a thread now bound to theirs. Words in his language flowed around Gideon like warm water, not translation, but communion. Then, with gravity that made the room lean forward, he placed his hand over Gideon's chest and said in halting English, "You are my son." The lodge was very still. The world was very loud. Gideon felt the sentence enter him and find every empty corner. He had not known he was waiting for this until it arrived. He had not known how cold he had been until warmth flooded him so completely that the edges of his sight blurred. Ayana's hand covered her mouth, eyes shining. Red Willow whooped once and then pretended he hadn't. The aunties nodded as if a stubborn bowl had finally set right on its shelf. Gideon bowed his head because he could not hold up the weight of being seen and stay standing all at once. When he lifted it, he found Takakota's gaze steady and unsmiling, as if to say, "Love is not a favor. It is a task you will take up every day." Gideon answered without words. He would. Spring unthreaded the snows, and with it came changes subtle and steady. Ayana walked farther, and sometimes returned with more than herbs, a feather caught in a willow fork, a smooth stone shaped like a heart, a bit of river glass that had no business this far inland. "Gift," she would say, pressing it to Gideon's palm with quiet mischief. "For light." He kept them all, the way a man keeps small, true things close. Their language grew plump with private meanings. When Ayana said fire, she meant not only flame, but the heat that had taken up residence between their ribs. When Gideon said home, he meant not only lodge and valley, but the circle that formed whenever her eyes found his across any distance and held. They spoke sparingly, as if not to startle this soft, clear animal that had wandered into their lives. But when they did speak, it was without fence or flinch. On an afternoon cleaned by rain, they climbed to the ridge above the camp, where the world fell away in long, sighing distances. The sky had torn itself open to blue, and distant peaks wore the last of winter, like shawls slipping from their shoulders. Ayana stood at the edge, wind pooling her hair back, and closed her eyes. Gideon watched, not with hunger, but with a quiet awe that felt like gratitude given a body. When she opened them, she found him, as she always did, exactly where she had left him. "Before," she said, and her voice was the careful stitching of new cloth, "I think I would become only pain. Now I am more." She touched the seam at her side, then her heart, then the hawk stone that hung from a cord around her neck. She smiled, and in the curve of it, Gideon felt every night he had kept the fire for her come back to him as warmth he could keep. "You," she added simply, not as praise, not as debt, but as naming. He wanted to answer with something big, something that could hold the weight of what he felt. But the mountains had taught him that the truest things arrive small. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the brush of his knuckles, an oath he didn't need language to swear. Her eyes softened. The ridge held its breath. The wind, even the wind, seemed to allow this. They stood until the sun tipped and the valley called them to the work of evening. As they started down, Gideon's gaze snagged on a thin line of smoke far beyond the camp, a thread too straight to be a cooking fire. It rose from the direction of the fort, from men who wore blue and preferred their stories clean. He felt the old chill move along his spine, not the lonely cold of a cave, but the bracing chill before a swim in deep water. All winter they had learned each other. All winter they had practiced a language of care. Spring had come, and with it the season that asks if what you've learned can live beyond your door. He glanced at Ayana. She had seen it too. Her expression did not shudder or sharpen. It stayed steady, like a hand held out in the dark and found. They walked on, each step easy, each step sure. carrying between them the warm, living pulse of something that had survived the storm and made a home in their bones. Whatever the smoke meant, orders, questions, a visit, would meet them together, and together they would answer. The smoke line on the far horizon thinned and thickened with the day's breath, a single thread drawn between worlds that did not yet know how to name each other without sharpness. In the weeks that followed, it appeared and disappeared as if testing the sky for permission, a reminder that stories do not end just because a winter does. Life in the valley continued its gentle work, wood split and stacked, hides scraped until they shone like river stones, children racing the creek's laughter. But beneath the fabric of ordinary care there ran a quiet, steady current, the knowledge that someone would come asking for an accounting. Gideon felt it, without letting it own him. He rose before dawn and walked the lodge circle, greeting old men whose eyes had the soft distance of snowfields and young mothers whose hands were always busy. He learned to splice rawhide so cleanly the splice could not be found. He learned to set a snare that released what it did not need. He learned to hold a baby so carefully that the mother sighed, as if the world for a breath was as kind as it should be, and in all of it he learned his own heart, which had once been a locked room, now a door quietly propped open. When he looked at Ayana, he no longer feared the word that rose inside him. Love did not arrive like thunder. It settled like a blanket, one woven strand at a time, until warmth was not a miracle, but a daily truth. Ayana's strength returned with the patience of growing things. She walked farther each morning, her step sure on the softening ground. The scar at her side, once an angry seam, now read like a line in a song, part of the melody, not the whole. She gathered herbs on the slope where sunlight lingered, teaching Gideon which leaf whispered soothe and which root promised sleep. When he misremembered, she laughed softly and pressed his palm to the right plant. "Here," she said, the word a gift rather than a correction. He carried her baskets without being asked, and, when she paused to breathe, pointed out the hawk that circled high enough to be thought sky. Sometimes they spoke, but mostly they shared the same air with ease, like two notes that had learned how to harmonize. One afternoon, a runner arrived from the western ridge, a boy with legs like willow wands and a grin that tried to hide the fact he'd sprinted a long way. He spoke quickly to Takakota. Gideon caught only a few English pebbles in the stream of words. Captain, fort, talk. The chief listened, then looked toward the horizon, toward the thin smoke, and nodded once. When his gaze fell to Gideon, there was no question in it, only inclusion. "Come," Takakota said. "We meet where water bends." They walked without hurry, but without delay, a small party moving along the ridgeline where wind combed the grasses. Red Willow went ahead, the runner stayed at Takakota's side, and Gideon and Ayana trailed by a few paces, speaking with their steps more than their mouths. Below, the valley narrowed into a corridor of cottonwoods that drank from a stream. The meeting place revealed itself the way kindness reveals itself, quietly, with no need for fanfare. A flat of pale stones, a fallen tree polished by seasons, water curving around them like an arm. Captain Morrison was already there with 4 men, their horses tethered beneath the trees. The captain's posture was what Gideon remembered, alert but not sharpened to a blade. He took off his hat as Takakota approached, an act not of deference but of respect, and that small difference mattered. Introductions were not needed. Winter had introduced them thoroughly. Morrison's gaze moved to Gideon and then, with a flicker of surprise softening the soldier's face, to Ayanna standing straight and whole beside him. He inclined his head to her and to the hawk stone at her throat. "Chief Takakota," Morrison said, choosing words as if they might bruise if dropped. "I came to keep a promise I made to myself when the snow was higher, to listen before assuming." "Good," Takakota answered in English that had grown surer through long practice with Gideon. "Listen is better than shoot." A crease that might become a smile touched Morrison's mouth. "That's what I aim for." They sat. No one rushed the shape of the talk. It shaped itself. Morrison spoke first of the three men, of the trial waiting at the fort, of the marshal's widow, whose letter had arrived ink-blotted with grief and steadiness. He did not make their crime grander than it was, and in refusing to make it larger, he made it no smaller. An honesty that felt like clear water. He spoke of the worries in the settlement, rumors about raids that had not happened, fists tightened by fear, how a single misunderstanding can light brush and then forest. "I can't stop all of it," he said, a man not performing virtue but confessing a limit. "I can keep my men from acting like a hammer when what's needed is a hand." Takakota listened without moving, the way stone listens. When he spoke, it was not to re-argue winter, but to lay down summer. "We want no war," he said. "We want the children to grow tall. We want the deer to return, the women to sing their work, the men to bring meat without bringing sorrow. Your law is not mine, my law is not yours, but breath is the same, water is the same. If one side poisons them, the other side drinks it too." Morrison nodded slowly, as if each sentence were not only heard, but stored. His glance slid to Gideon. "You have a place here," he said, not quite asking. Gideon felt Ayanna's sleeve brush his knuckles and answered in the simplest way, "I do." "Then I will speak plainly to you, because plain speech carries farther." Morrison's eyes held no threat, only the steadiness of a man who has chosen a road. "There will be settlers who do not see this valley as home but as a ledger. There will be officers who prefer a tidy report to a true one. There will be men who think grief gives them permission to be cruel. When that comes, and it will come, I'll need a voice between, someone the fort will hear, someone the valley will trust." Gideon's mouth went dry. He was a boy taught by snow and hunger and a girl's brave breath. He was not a diplomat, not a preacher, not a man whose words had ever been used for anything but survival and tenderness. He looked at Takakota. The chief did not rescue him. He did something gentler. He placed the burden where it belonged. When two fires burn, we need someone to hold a pot above both so water doesn't boil away. Ayanna's eyes found his, full of a quiet yes. Gideon felt the old fear of becoming small again, becoming only the cave, only the silence, pass through him like a cloud shadow. The feeling left the warmth unchanged. "I can carry words," he said. "I can carry them careful." Morrison's shoulders eased. "Then let's carry them together." He unrolled a map that looked as if it had been walked on more than read, and together they drew boundaries that were less lines than understandings, where soldiers would not tread without invitation, where hunters would leave offerings so ranchers could see respect rather than theft, where traders could meet with open hands and leave with open hands. They agreed to signs that would mean help and do not enter, to places where a messenger could be found and fed and sent swiftly on. The map ended up less ink than stones, this tree, that bend, the hill that looks like a sleeping bison. It was not a treaty anyone else would recognize, which was perhaps why it held. When the talk was done, Morrison stood and, after a heartbeat's considering, offered his hand to Takakota. The chief, who had shaken many hands and refused many, took this one. Then the captain turned to Ayana and, with a gravity that felt earned, bowed his head. "I am glad you live," he said. "English, when used with care, can be a tender language." He left with his men, not triumphant, not defeated, simply a man leaving a place where he had chosen not to set a fire. They watched the soldiers disappear into cottonwoods and distance. The valley breathed. Red Willow made a noise in his throat that meant he was relieved and pretending he wasn't. Takakota rolled the map and tucked it beneath his robe. "Work," he said. "Good work." He started back toward camp with the runner at his side. Gideon and Ayana stayed. They sat on the fallen tree where the bark had worn smooth. Water lapped at their boots and polished stones into patience. He turned the hawkstone in his fingers. She toyed with the wooden bird he had carved in winter. Neither of them needed to name what had just happened. The day had written it on their bodies, the looseness of shoulders no longer braced, the way their breaths matched without trying. "You carry words well," Ayana said after a while. It was not praise, it was a noticing. "Only because you taught me how to listen," he answered. That made her smile in a way that reached past lips, to eyes, to a place beneath bone. Clouds pushed their long shadows over the grass. Gideon stood and offered his hand. She took it without looking, as if the taking were as natural as the water's curve. They walked back the long way, along the ridge where the world went on forever, and the wind kept the taste of snow. He told her what the captain had said. She told him what the hawk had done above them as men talked, and in the exchange something bright knitted tighter between them, strong enough to be called by its true name, not fragile enough to spook when named. Spring worked its quiet changes with the persistence of prayer. Calves shivered to their feet, willow buds fattened and opened. Elders told the same stories again and found new corners of meaning in old rooms. Gideon rose and shouldered tasks before someone asked. He failed often enough to stay humble and succeeded often enough to stay brave. He found that belonging is less a gift than a practice you renew every day with your hands, with your words, with your patience. One evening, after a day of mending harness and teaching Elm to cut notches without slicing her thumb, Gideon walked to the edge of camp where the tall grass made its own soft music. He found Ayana there, her dress catching the last light, her hair braided with a sprig of sage. He knew without being told that she had come here to be alone with the day. He stopped a little way off and let the quiet unfold between them until it beckoned him closer. When he reached her, she turned so that her shoulder brushed his chest, a small permission. "Before the snow," she said, speaking slowly the way she did when choosing English for what English could hold. "My life was a circle drawn by others. I loved that circle. It was safe. Now it is larger. It has your steps in it." He swallowed. The thing in his throat did not feel like fear. "Mine too," he said. He was not ashamed that his voice came out rough. He was not ashamed of any of it anymore. They stood with the breeze pushing gently at their clothes, at their hair. He lifted his hand and found her face with the back of his fingers, a touch so light it barely counted as touch. Yet it counted. She did not move away. He cupped her cheek with his palm, and she leaned into it, and in that leaning 2 winters melted that were never made of snow. They did not kiss, not yet. The air around them felt like a vow waiting for breath to finish its sentence. A hawk rode a high current, and the light went gold, then honey, then the grey that asks for fire. They walked home side by side, not hurry, not delay, arriving as the first stars pricked the sky. Takakota looked up from his work as they entered the lodge and nodded, the way a father nods when he sees that what he hoped might happen has begun to happen, and he will not frighten it by naming it too soon. In the night, Gideon woke to the sound of rain. It drummed lightly on hide and earth, one of those soft storms that expects to be listened to. He lay with his eyes open and let it speak to all the rooms inside him that had once felt empty and now felt furnished with simple, good things. A place by the fire, a work to do, a name that sounded right in other people's mouths, a hand he could find in the dark. He thought of the map made of trees and bends and sleeping bison hills. He thought of the captain who had chosen to be careful. He thought of the men who would come anyway, with their ledgers and hard hats, the ones who love only what they can count. He thought of the hawk's shadow, of the way Ayana's breath had settled when his had, and he understood the next season's work without anyone telling him. Morning would bring it closer. Morning always does. He rolled toward the fire, and in the glow he saw Ayana shift in sleep, her hand drifting near the hawkstone, her mouth soft with the dream of safety someone else now tended with her. Gideon closed his eyes and let the rain count time. The valley had chosen him back. A love was not something to be survived, but something to be served. And when the sun rose and the smoke on the horizon braided itself into the blue once more, he would rise too, ready to carry words, to carry wood, to carry joy, to carry whatever needed carrying, so that the circle that held them all might hold. The valley unfolded in summer's quiet generosity, a place gilded with long light and the easy breath of green things. Grass swayed in slow waves, children's laughter lifted with the wind, and smoke from the lodges curled upward like steady prayers. Gideon walked among it all, carrying water, splitting wood, learning the small rhythms that made a day whole. He no longer measured life by how many scraps of food lay in a pouch or how much wood would outlast the storm. Now he measured it by the curve of Ayana's smile at dawn, by the warmth of Takakota's nod when he finished a task well, by the sound of voices around the fire. The boy who had once belonged only to silence now belonged to people, and that belonging healed him in ways no food ever could. Ayana's recovery became part of the camp's own story. Her scar remained, but it no longer spoke only of pain. It spoke of survival, of trust earned, of a thread between 2 lives stitched in firelight. She walked easily now, her steps carrying her father each morning to the creek, to the herb fields, to the ridges where hawks traced circles above. Gideon went with her often, not as a guard, but as something softer, a companion whose steps knew how to match hers. They spoke less and less of the storm that had bound them, and more of what lay ahead. Their language, once broken and halting, had become a bridge broad enough for laughter, for tenderness, for words that brushed against the edge of love without fear of falling. The tribe welcomed Gideon not as a guest, not even as an outsider tolerated, but as kin. Red Willow teased him as brothers do. Elm braided his hair with wildflowers. The aunties pressed second helpings into his hands and scolded him gently when he worked too hard. At night he sat beside Takakota, learning the weight of decisions, the patience of a man who knew each life in the circle was a thread in his keeping. Gideon had once been a shadow boy, surviving on scraps of warmth. Now he was a son, a brother, a friend. And through it all, Ayana's presence was the quiet flame at the center of his days. Her laughter healed him. Her gaze steadied him. Her touch, light as a bird wing when she brushed his arm, reminded him that love could grow even in soil broken by loss. But the horizon did not stay still. Sometimes, from the high ridges, Gideon saw faint lines of smoke, too straight to be from cooking fires, riders whose shadows stretched long in the sun. The world beyond the valley was shifting, restless, full of men who measured land by ledger and river by claim. The piece they had woven was delicate, a cloth easily torn by careless hands. Gideon knew it, and Takakota knew it too. Yet when the chief looked at him, there was no despair, only a steady trust. Words had been carried before, and they would be carried again. Courage was not always a blade drawn. Sometimes it was the choice to keep talking, to keep building bridges where the world preferred walls. One evening, when the sun spilled gold across the mountains, Ayana and Gideon climbed to the ridge where they had once stood in early spring. Now the world below was lush and full, the river glinting like silver thread stitched into green cloth. Ayana's hair shone in the light, her eyes deep with the calm of someone who had faced death and chosen to live fully. She reached into her pouch and drew out the hawk stone, pressing it into Gideon's hand again. He looked at her, startled, but her smile was soft, steady. "Not just mine," she said, her English careful, her meaning vast. "Ours." He closed his fist around the stone, feeling its familiar weight. But this time it was not a burden. It was a promise, a symbol not of survival alone, but of the life they were building, together, in trust, in warmth, in the gentle courage of love. He tucked the stone against his chest, and when he looked at her again, her hand had already found his, their fingers laced as naturally as branches twining in the same wind. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, full to overflowing with all the words they no longer needed to say. As dusk folded its lavender shawl across the peaks, they returned to the camp, hand in hand. Fires glowed, voices rose, children played in the last light. Gideon felt the circle close around him, not a cage, but a home. He had walked from loneliness into belonging, from hunger into abundance, from silence into the music of shared breath. And beside him, Ayana walked not as the girl he had once saved, but as the woman who had saved him in return. The stars opened above, wide and forgiving. Gideon looked up at them, then down at the life now his, and felt peace settle into him like a coal glowing steady at the core. The boy who had once thought himself nothing more than a shadow had found not just love, but family, tribe, home, and he knew with a certainty as sure as the mountains rising around him he would never be alone again. If this story has touched something quiet in your heart, If you have felt even a spark of warmth or healing in its telling, let it live beyond these words. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe so that this journey of love, courage, and belonging may continue to unfold, together with you as part of the circle too.